Do 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 do. Muglaw. Well, good. Hello. You are tuned into Glofcast 9. I hope you all enjoyed my talk with Andrew Joakim last week, and I apologize once again for the audio quality. Hopefully, Andrew and I will get back together at some point in the future to talk again with better quality. But if you can muster it, it is a good talk, and I do recommend listening to it. I do have some bad news, though. Due to a copyright claim, this podcast can no longer be called Glofcast. Sad day. But luckily, I have a backup. Now I want you to close your eyes. Close them, close them, close them. This is some nice AMSR. And I want you to envision in your mind this vision that I'm about to tell you right now. I'm an old man. I'm 50 years old, bald, fat, white, and divorced. I wear gas station sunglasses, a Menards baseball cap, a whistle around my neck, Wrangler jeans, and a shirt that says XXL despite only being a large on a daily basis. Everywhere I go, I make sure I always have a clipboard. My name is Coach. Prepare to die. And since my name is Coach, I present to you a very special gift. This, my children, is Coachcast. Episode 1. April Fools. This is still the Glofcast, so hope you enjoyed whatever that was. The subject I want to cover this week is float tanks, and specifically relating float tanks to the Orthodox Christian practice of Hesychasm. Now, just to preface, I am currently doing a side job, a little side part-time job at a float tank, and I have floated multiple times since starting, well, over the course of my life, really, but it's been about a total of about 12 times, 12 90-minute floats in my life. Within the past year at least, so that's more than enough. So that's enough experience, in my opinion, to comment on that. Now, a future podcast I'm planning on doing, I'm not sure when, but it's just going to be me talking about the results of floating for every day for an extended period of time. I'm either thinking maybe a week to 30 days. But this podcast is not going to turn into Floatcast. But I may wane out a little bit of the comedy shit, or maybe just do like Loft extras every few weeks, just for some shit that I think is funny, and maybe try to run with it. But anyway, in case you don't know what a float tank is, it's essentially laying in a box or a tank or a pod filled with water and thousands of pounds of Epsom salt dissolved in the water. And it's essentially several times saltier than the Dead Sea, which means that you are floating. No matter how hard you may struggle, you are going to float. And you can't see or hear anything. And the salt helps your breathing clear up so you don't smell anything either. And you're floating in a tank with water heated up to your body temperature so you feel nothing as well, either with a sensation of touch or sensing temperature. So in short, your senses are completely deprived, which means that you are wrestling with nothing other but your own thoughts. So you're not really distracted by any sensory inputs that you may be sensing in that moment. You're literally only wrestling with your own thoughts. Or if you don't have any thoughts, you're one of those lucky people, you're just literally being for a minimum of 60 minutes. You are just simply being. You are just awareness in and of itself, lying in this float tank. And so it's usually a minimum of 60 minutes. I prefer to go 90 minutes, and eventually I want to try to go for at least 2 hours to 3 hours. So most people have heard of these float tanks, and a lot of people report psychedelic experiences. I know if you've listened to Joe Rogan, he's talked about this numerous times, about the psychedelic experiences he has within the float tank. And unfortunately, I never really had anything like that with regards to that. The closest I had to something like that during a floating experience was a few times ago when I floated. I was in a hypnagogic state. So think of that as a state of somewhere in between sleeping and wakefulness. So kind of the border there, if you will. And during this hypnagogic state, there was still a sense of awareness about me. And I sensed these entities or dragons above me. I didn't see them. I didn't hear them or smell or sense them really in any traditional sense of the word. But I sensed them in some like ESP type of way almost. I didn't. So yeah, I sensed them, and I also sensed my sense of self. So my ego, if you will, my identity, kind of everything that I've clung on to up to this point. It is almost being sucked away by these entities above me and forcing its stuff to stay within myself. And I kind of forced myself to, I guess, fought off these entities and kind of, I guess, protected my egos, because that's not really something I would think that is traditionally pleasant. But it's a cliche experience with regards to spiritual experiences. But it's one that I don't really think can be conveyed properly with words. It's the closest thing that you can really say something about that is ego death. And I've had some, I think, fairly close experiences with that. And this one was kind of distant as far as those ones go. But it was definitely, I would kind of put it more in that category. So, yeah, that's kind of a basic float tank experience in a very basic nutshell. So you're essentially lying within a tank and being mindful of nothing but your thoughts. So with all of that said, what is hesychasm? And moreover, how does the floating experience relate to this thing called hesychasm? So with regards to hesychasm, I found a variety of definitions as I just found out about this thing a few weeks ago. But a most basic definition can be called a special kind of prayer used within the Orthodox Christian tradition. And I found a bit of conflicting definitions, at least kind of at first glance they appear to be conflicting, but that is one that I think pretty much everybody can agree on. So keep in mind that I am not of the Orthodox Christian tradition or the Orthodox tradition, but rather the Roman Catholic tradition. And I am I guess you could say, semi-practicing Catholic. I've, in my opinion, I'm going to go into this on a later podcast. I have a complex relationship with Catholicism, which I'm going to go into on a later podcast. But I wanted to preface that since I was unfamiliar with what hesychasm was until very recently. So, other conflicting definitions, i.e. the Wikipedia definition, it references hesychasm as something to the Gospel of Matthew chapter 6, verse 6, which states, "When thou prayest, enter into thy closet, and when thou hast shut thy door, pray." So that's the King James version with the thys and the thous. But the implication there is that hesychasm involves a sort of retiring inward as a way to pray contemplatively and reach what is known as experiential knowledge of God, or theoria. So I'm not a theologian, but from what I understand, Orthodox theology differs quite a bit from Roman Catholic theology in that they're almost two on kind of separate sides of the same spectrum. So Orthodoxy specifically emphasizes the experience of God, the revelation of God, given to those who lead virtuous lives and kind of seek God, which, to me at least, it's not dissimilar from the born-again evangelical Protestants in that regard. And that's not a knock on Orthodoxy at all. That's just kind of a parallel that I'm drawing as kind of an outside observer. Whereas the Catholic tradition, and specifically the Thomist theology, it emphasizes that one can arrive to God, at least in some capacity, using traditional Hellenic reason, specifically, like, for example, Aquinas' 5 ways or cosmological arguments. The ways that I personally find compelling, and that's kind of pretty much what kind of brought me back to theism. And I'm going to do a video on that later on, I think, or a podcast on that later on. So at first glance, these two theologies appear to be on opposite ends of the particular spectrum, but that that's not the topic of this video. So let's go back to Matthew chapter 6, verse 6. That implies a turning inward of contemplative prayer by intentionally depriving all other senses, so that the individual praying doesn't have a choice but to, quote unquote, turn inward. Now, the person praying cannot distract themselves by mindfulness of the world around them, since, for all intents and purposes, that world does not exist. And hesychasm is ultimately a contemplative prayer involving the entirety of the being, including the body, mind, spirit, and soul. So this is separate kind of from what you would call the Gnostic idea of kind of the self. I've been reading a little bit about Gnosticism lately. I just got a new book on it, which I'm probably going to do a podcast on that as well. The goal of hesychasm is the direct perception of God, otherwise known as the mystic light or uncreated light. And that term uncreated light was coined to Gregory Palamas in the 14th century while defending the hesychastic tradition from, I believe, Barlam, I want to say. And he also made the essence energies distinction, kind of distinguishing what God is and what God does for, I guess, that'd kind of be a lay definition of it. It refers specifically to the light, by the uncreated light, that refers specifically to the light the Apostle Paul saw during his conversion, aka the transfiguration, i.e. the divine revelation. So, in other words, the uncreated light is the uncreated energies of God. So, it's not God himself, or itself, or himself, since in Orthodox theology, God is unknowable and nobody can see God face to face in this world. But it's I'm not going to say part, since I guess, yeah, the actions and the energies are distinct. And with regards to parts and wholeness and parts, at least in Thomist theology, which is what I'm most familiar with, there's a certain implication that comes with the word part because of divine simplicity. The word part should not be associated with God due to divine simplicity, but the uncreated light is a divine energy, or think of it in terms of a divine action. And I don't want to say the divine energy, because at least in my opinion, that comes to imply to be limiting God, and God is essentially infinite, and saying the divine energy, at least to me, kind of comes with the implication that there is only one divine energy and not an infinite amount of divine energies. And so to me, I could be wrong in this, but that appears to be kind of limiting God from an Orthodox perspective, and that's not legitimate. But I will say that it is the divine energy Paul saw during the transfiguration, and that is the goal of hesychasm. So Jay Dyer referred to it as the prayer of the soul. But the thing with hesychasm is it does incorporate everything else, including the mind, body, spirit, and soul. And it's a prayer encompassing the totality of the human being. And I do understand that there's a bit of risks coming with the hesychastic methodology. I have been looking a little bit about this with regards to that, like, what kind of happens during hesychasm? I've heard of like astral projections and stuff like that, just stuff that's, it really doesn't really help you to know God any further, and just kind of stuff like that. I have known that have been a certain spiritual danger with regards to hesychasm. But hesychasm is a highly mystical prayer practice, and one that depends more on experience and purity of the mind, body, and soul, as opposed to simple study, which is more the Roman Catholic tradition, although not, I wouldn't say really entirely. Hesychasm, it was never really condemned or anything like that in the Roman Catholic circles, but it has actually begun to get a renewed interest. So, with all of this being said, how exactly does hesychasm relate to float tanks? Well, in my opinion, a float tank, it's the hesychasm methodology repackaged for a modern secular audience. And so, what is the hesychastic method anyway? So, St. Gregory of Sinai advises, with regards to the hesychastic method, sitting on a low stool with the head and shoulders hunched inward towards the heart. And I think this is because the Orthodox view the heart as the convergence between mind and matter, the centrality and primary organ of the human being. And this position, it's not exactly supposed to be comfortable, and that's almost kind of the point. So bear in mind this position will likely become uncomfortable after a while. And also within the hesychastic process, the person must control their breathing and rhythmize it to the syllables of the Jesus prayer. The prayer repeated during hesychasm, which goes, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And however, the repetition of the Jesus prayer should be differentiated between, for example, an Eastern mantra, because with hesychasm and the repetition of the Jesus prayer, it's not supposed to be anything necessarily mindless or just simply stringing together syllables for the sake of, I guess, having something to focus on. Now, you should be focusing on the Jesus prayer, but you really should be saying each syllable of it, each word of it, every part of it with the utmost, I guess, awareness and reverence. It's not really supposed to be something that gets you into a trance in kind of an Eastern type of way. It's supposed to be, I would call it similar to the Roman Catholic rosary in that regard. Although when I pray the rosary daily for the past few years, most days, to be honest with you, I've largely treated it as a string of syllables. And I have recently actually fallen out of saying the rosary everyday practice, which I probably should really get back into. And so, just to preface, the hesychastic methodology has about 3 main parts. I just named the first 2, the kind of tuning inward towards the heart and the Jesus prayer and kind of the rhythmizing the breathing to the Jesus prayer. And the third main point of the hesychastic process is the resting or the retiring inward, like I said before. Or you can view that as the internal exploration with the focus being placed towards the heart. Like I said earlier, with the kind of viewing the heart as the centrality of the human being. So this is similar to a yogi or somebody in the more Eastern traditions raising awareness of every part of his body. By retiring inward, the hesychast will focus his entire being and awareness on his heart, the lifeblood and focal point of the entirety of the human being. In hesychasm, the mind, body, spirit, and soul are literally oriented to be towards the heart. So I compared this to a yogi earlier. A lot of times when I would go into the float tank, that's kind of the methodology that I would use. I would create awareness of every part of my body and all the way starting from my feet up to my brain and my head. And the hesychastic tradition, it's all completely focused towards the heart as opposed to kind of going through that little process right there. So in a similar sense, the float tank deprives the senses as much as possible and forces the floater to retire inward in some sense or another, forcing the floater to contend with nothing else but the mind or the entirety of the being. Now, the goal of float tanks, to be honest, is highly dependent on the person floating, but can be anything to relieve pain, relax, see psychedelic shit, increase mental clarity, or really any of that. It's like asking what the point of a wrench is or something like that. Every once in a while, I've heard of floaters going in for the purposes of having a mystical or spiritual experience, but float tanks are mostly used for materialist purposes from what I have gathered. Not to say there's anything wrong with that, but I'm wondering if it would be a heresy or something in order to combine the hesychastic tradition with a float tank experience, since nothing retires the senses more than a float tank. The details of the hesychastic method would have to be, I guess, ironed out within the tank, obviously, such as the physical turning in towards the heart and that orientation. But I personally think it could be done. I've considered bringing the rosary into the float tank and praying that way. And I may still do that at some point just to focus entirely on the prayer itself. So there has been a point in the past where I have, basically I was kind of in the float tank and I have, essentially I was kind of my mind was getting a little bit restless, so I did actually say the rosary, and I'm going to talk about that here in a little bit. So personally, as somebody who's floated multiple times and has used the tank in order to help me with the CPA exam, The float tank is best when used as, like I said earlier, a tool or a supplement in preparation for something else. Now, the MMA fighter Justin Wren said on the Joe Rogan Experience, at one point he used it in preparation for an upcoming fight. And with that, he kind of went into the float tank, and when he was in there, he kind of just completely envisioned it, how exactly it was going to go down. And strangely enough, it actually did end up going down exactly the way he envisioned it. So yeah, it's a really powerful tool. I've seen Navy SEALs use it, professional sports players like Steph Curry have used it in preparation for games. Certain MMA fighters obviously have used it. And like I said before, as somebody who's floated about a dozen times at the time of this podcast, the float tank, it's best used when in conjunction with something else. And whether that's an upcoming test you may have, or an upcoming sports event or fight, or just as a kind of a kickstarter to meditation, the float tank is a tool, and one with cumulative benefits. But to go into the tank for the purpose of simply relaxing is just... it's a bit nearsighted and, in my opinion, a bit directionless. Now, I'm not saying it can't or shouldn't be done for a lot of people, as the float tank is obviously a fantastic tool for relaxing. But to me, the float tank works best when you supplement it with something else that you're trying to achieve with your life. Now, in one of my more recent floats, I mentioned this earlier, I did say a few decades of the rosary while in the tank, and that shifted me from a listless and kind of discontent state of mind to something a little bit deeper than that. And it was a deeper contentment for not just the state of being while in the float tank, but bliss and gratitude towards the entirety of being itself, within and without the float tank, and within God himself from a classical theist perspective. And with regards to being itself, I've kind of noticed that the Western and Eastern practices, in my opinion, they're far more similar to each other than one might believe at first glance, in that both, I guess I'm kind of vastly oversimplifying both, I guess, schools, the Abrahamic and the Dharmic, but in both practices, they have the same end with regards to removing the barrier between the self and being itself, at least to some capacity, and they may not exactly call it that. They may have some kind of some maybe esoteric terminology with regards to that, but that's almost, if you could just almost boil it down to, albeit, like I said earlier, the Abrahamic and Dharmic ways to achieve this, it may differ quite a bit with regards to methodology, such as the more Eastern mantras versus the, I guess, Abrahamic Hesychasm. But that is a digression. Although I wonder that since many of these religions are trying to remove this barrier between ego and being, if the ego is some sort of de-evolution in a sense. But once again, I digress because this is getting a bit esoteric. So I'll leave this podcast off by asking a few questions. Have you ever used a float tank? If so, did you supplement it with some sort of prayer, or hesychastic or otherwise? And do you think a float tank is a proper supplement to a spiritual practice? So anyways, it's Sunday night and I'm tired, so next week is my 10th podcast, and I already have kind of a topic in mind for that one, and I have a bunch of topics lined up afterward. But if I keep my sequence, next week's podcast may be my most personal one yet. So it's, yeah, that one's going to be a fun one. So thank you for listening, and I will talk to you all next week. Take care.